Happy Sunday, everybody. It's Rae Chesny here, Zora Neale Hurston Scholar for the Zora Neale Hurston Trust. And I'm very excited because today is a very special day. It happens to be Zora Neale Hurston's birthday. And so we will be celebrating her live. And as you guys are coming in, you can just drop your happy birthday Zoras in the comments so we know that you're ready to have this conversation. Now, I'm super excited because throughout today's conversation, we're going to have lots of good news for you all to celebrate Zora. And so, right around 12 o'clock, Dr. Kendi is going to join. If you guys can't hear me, I see someone says sound up, sound off. If you guys can't hear me, if you can, give me a thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. And I'm going to turn my volume up too. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. And let's see some happy birthday, Zora. So I think you guys can hear me. That's wonderful. Oh, hello, Dr.
Hey,
Kendi.
Ray, how are you?
I'm good. I'm excited. Someone had me nervous. They said the sound was off. But we're getting some happy birthday Zoras in the comments. So I think we're good to go.
Yes, yeah, it is truly an honor to sit here and celebrate Zora's birthday today. How are you feeling? How did you wake up today?
Excited. I feel like she gave me the nudge, like, hey, girl, get up because it's my birthday. I need you to do some work for me. And I love that. It's truly an honor. And while everyone is popping in, Dr. Kendi, if it's okay, I want to take a moment to give you some flowers because, as you know, if Zora loved your work, that's what she was about in her time. She loved County Cullen, and she told him emphatically, if she didn't love your work, she let you know that too. But Dr. Kendi, this is our third conversation now, our third conversation around Zora. And I feel deeply honored to be in conversation with you, specifically around Zora, but to watch your journey in the loving way that you honor Zora and her legacy. I cannot lie. I thought Magnolia Flower was going to be the top of this 6-book adaptation of Zora's work. And then Cameron, my son, we thought it was going to be the making of butterflies. And then you came with Barracoon, adapted for young readers. And if you don't yet follow Dr. Kendi, you number one should. But if you don't know, Dr. Kendi has all the credentials to be pretentious, to be inaccessible, but he is not. In the opening of Barracoon, this is the advanced reader copy right behind me. He talks about how magical Zora is and how important to him it is that children start to engage with her legacy and the many gifts she left us. So, Dr. Kendi, thank you. Thank you, thank you for doing this work.
Well, I really do appreciate that, especially coming from you. I mean, you're one of, the world's great scholars of Zora Neale Hurston and really great champions, Hurston, as reflected by the trust, the family of Zora Neale Hurston, entrusting um, her legacy and her work, in you, and so I'm certainly honored, and overjoyed that you would say that, and indeed, I don't know of a better way to honor the legacy, of a writer than figuring out new ways to introduce that writer to new audiences. And I am someone who did not read Zora Neale Hurston until college. And, to this day, I am just angry about that. Right. And, I have two daughters, and my daughters have already read Zora Neale Hurston, and they're months, another is 7 years old. And to me, that's the beauty of creating adapting these books, for our children.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, so Dr. Kendi is a girl dad twice over now. And I know our oldest definitely keeps you on your toes. And I feel like she gives you a little bit of that drenched in light Zora energy, Isis Watts. very bold, very courageous, very confident in who she is. And I love the fact that you have taken this opportunity to say, hey, even in my own house, I'm connecting my daughters with the legacy of a powerful woman. Today is Zora's 133rd birthday, and you are keeping her legacy going. And I thank you for your kind words, because every time that we get to have conversations with others who are doing the work for not just Zora, but now we're talking our ancestors. We're talking Olu Kasula, Cujo Lewis, right? And so there's this continuation, and to see our children holding Zora, because guys, I have a spoiler alert. I didn't read a Zora book. Actually, it was assigned to me in high school, and I did not read it. I was a reluctant reader, which is something Dr. Kendi and I share. We were both reluctant readers growing up. And so I didn't read Zora until 2018. I didn't. And it was Barracoon. That was my first book. And so to know that our children now have an opportunity to start earlier in a way that's accessible to them, thank you. Thank you. You guys have to give Dr. Kendi some flowers in our comments. This is so
So I
exciting.
did not know that. And it's just, I think it's also remarkable that in 5 or 6 years, you went from reading your first Zora book to potentially knowing as much about Zora as anyone else. Like,
Did, okay, you want to know the story, Dr. Kendi, how it happened?
yes.
Oh, so I think that Zora must be a forgiving ancestor, because I started out with children, writing children's book. My new children's book, Zora's Garden, is right behind me. And I had a partnership with Michigan State. They would send their students down to run the after school program that I had started. So I would train them, they would do the program. Well, the professor, who was my liaison, Dr. Kevin L. Brooks, he said, okay, wait, you're good with these 120 students from Detroit. They love your program. My students actually love running the program. Why don't you come to campus and do a Black History presentation? And this was in 2017. And I said, okay, on what? And he said, on the person who most influenced your career as a writer. But I was a reluctant reader. And at that point, I was very shy and a little bit ashamed of the fact that I had been a reluctant reader, but I always loved to tell stories. And so I started to decline the opportunity, but I could always talk. And he said these magic words, Dr. Kendi. He said, we will pay you an honorarium. I was like, I feel very inspired. It's coming, it's coming back to me. So I actually chose to do the presentation on Langston Hughes, because being a Black writer, I'm thinking Harlem Renaissance. I was a new mom at the time. I can brush up on some poetry. I'm good to go. But as I started researching Langston Hughes, I felt no connection to Langston whatsoever. And my cardinal sin is I cannot be bored, because my audience is going to be bored. And so as I'm researching him, Zora Neale Hurston keeps popping up. And I say, wait, that lady whose book I didn't read when it was assigned in high school. And I start to find all of these interesting facts about her. And I'm thinking, okay, her dad was the mayor of the first all-Black incorporated municipality in the history of the United States. 3 times he wrote some of the town's laws. She grew up there, you know. This is significant in history. She was a trained anthropologist in 1927, and she was Langston Hughes' best friend during the Harlem Renaissance. Why is no one talking about Zora? And it gut punched me, Dr. Kendi, because I was like, well, how come I'm not talking about Zora? And so I actually tacked her on to Langston, saying, and Zora Neale Hurston. And the whole time I was doing that presentation, I could tell I was more excited about Zora than talking about Langston Hughes. And I promised her in my head, if I ever get to do it again, you will be the star of the show. And I think that she heard me, because she has taken over, and I love it. And I feel deeply honored, to do this work for her.
And it's interesting you mentioned Langston Hughes, because I remember when my daughter Imani was born in 2016, and we were finding books for her. There were all these children's books on Langston's poetry, based on Langston's writings, and there simply wasn't nearly as much based on Zora Neale Hurston. And I think that's I think that was actually one of the first steps. I think,
So you think that's where it started for you? So both of us also have Langston pushing us along towards Zora. So we have to give him his
yeah,
thanks too.
I think that was part of it. I think the other part of it was I remember reading, um, I believe I remember reading Magnolia Flower, the short story, really listening to it on audiobook uh, during the pandemic. I think it was one of the first weeks in the pandemic. I was claustrophobic inside the house, and I was like, okay, I need to get outside uh, and just go for a jog. And so I popped in um, that audiobook, or an audiobook that had that story. And as I was listening to it, I was like, man, this would make for an incredible children's book. Similarly, had a similar feeling when I first read Barracoon. That I think the pulse of the story, the storytelling of Cujo Lewis, his relationship with his granddaughters, his sort of uh, banter, his funny banter with Zora Neale Hurston, the clarity of his storytelling, could make for quite the story. And I also knew that young people really gravitate to stories with characters, with major sort of characters that can really carry along the message, or in this case, the history. And so that was, I knew right when I ultimately was able to work with the Zora Neale Hurston Trust, that Barracoon would be a book I'd love to adapt.
Oh, so Dr. Kendi, I got some top secrets for you. Are you ready? Just because of the last thing you said. So at the Trust, everyone should know you can follow the Zora Neale Hurston Trust at Zora Neale Hurston Trust right here on Instagram. And they are the familial descendants of Zora. This is big. This is the family of Zora Neale Hurston, making sure that her legacy is available and accessible to everyone. And so for me working at the Trust, it's a huge, huge honor. And now Dr. Kendi is in partnership with the Trust to adapt these 6 books. So hopefully she doesn't get me. I won't call her out by name, but she's very special in our household. The trustee that I correspond with the most, she actually typed up by hand Barracoon twice. 2 submitted, the original one that was published in 2018. Did you know that?
I know that.
Oh, I'll have to email you and give you the real tea. Yeah, she typed it up twice. And actually, a documentarian, I can tell you who that is too. She was the one to kind of move that trustee along and say, hey, I think that this should be published. Because if our viewers, if you have not read the original Barracoon, it was published in 2018, but yes, and it's right behind me too. But Zora actually recorded Oluwale Kasula's personal narrative. It makes it feel like he's my grandfather, really. I have Southern grandparents. It makes it feel like he's my grandfather. The way that she so lovingly and respectfully recorded his personal narrative. This is not one of those in slavery happened in this year and this year. This is him saying, hey, this is who came into my village. This is who came into my village. This is who my people were. My grandfather, my father. This is the birth order I was in. This is what that experience was like. And she recorded it phonetically, just like he talked. And I agree with you. Children, I think all of us secretly, we become older and we don't want to associate with our childhood too much anymore. But all of us connect more deeply when we hear personal narrative, when we hear authentic voice. And I have to tell you, Dr. Kendi, when I read Barracoon adapted for young readers, blown away, absolutely blown away. To take what Zora did in 1927 and 1928 and then make that accessible in a way that children can really digest it, but also start to ask good questions about it. And that parents and educators can start to have appropriate levels of conversation with children around around the world, I won't even say the country, around the world, blown away, Dr. Kendi, blown away.
And I think that over the last few years, we've had a lot of conversations in the United States and even other countries about teaching children about slavery. And obviously, there have been some people who've argued that we shouldn't be teaching, young people about slavery and have tried to ban books. And others like me have been advocating for us to teach young people about everything, about all parts of our history. But I think it's important for us to not just advocate the teaching of slavery. We have to provide developmentally appropriate materials for parents, for teachers, for educators to be able to use, right? With their children. And so for me, that was part of the impetus for Barracoon, this adapted for young people. And the other thing is, you mentioned Cujo almost sounding like your grandfather, and it's interesting. I had a similar thought, and I did not grow up with grandfathers. My father's father, my father never knew his father, and my mother's father died, I believe, 2 years before I was born. And so it's but being able to watch my daughter, who is about to turn 8 years old, and Barracoon Adapted is for kids 8 to 12 years old, have conversations with her two grandfathers, and being able to see the stories her grandfathers tell to her, and being able to sort of witness that and appreciate that, I think really allowed me to get in the emotional and conceptual and literary space to adapt this book. Because in my mind, I was thinking, how would Cujo tell this story if he was telling it not necessarily to Zora, but to one of those granddaughters that he gives those peaches to, in the story. How would my grandfather tell this story to me? How would Imani's grandfather tell this story to her?
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I have to tell you, actually, I was my granddad's favorite. So that made it even more special. And actually, Cameron, his middle name is my grandfather's middle name. And they have like this connection, even though my grandfather passed the month before I found out I was pregnant with Cam. And so Cam does have a lot of interest in how my grandfather grew up and what types of things he liked to eat. And in Barracoon, we get that from Cujo. He's saying, Zora's, and I have to tell everybody, so imagine this is 1927 and Zora is traveling the very racist American South, right, to be a woman, Black woman anthropologist by herself, all by herself. In the first year she goes in, it's at the end of 1927, and she actually wrote Langston Hughes a letter. And I think it was just about a month ago, December 9th, December 10th. And she tells him, like, oh, I have to go interview this old man, right? And I got to get there before he dies. Zora could be very, as we all are, human. And she's saying, I'm going to interview him. He's old, he's going to die. But there's a transition because in 1927, Cujo wouldn't talk to her. Kasula wouldn't talk to her. And I could imagine one of the things we don't really understand is until you do the work, you don't know all the nuances behind it. You just see the product. Well, a lot of people are going to talk to Oluwale Kasula. He was sick of talking to people. And so Zora, in the same way you had to be vulnerable and say, oh, I'm imagining what my grandfather's, Cujo was my grandfather, how he would tell these stories to me. That's what Zora had to do, because we see her in 1927. She's on a fellowship funded by Carter G. Woodson. He funded half. And then Elsie Clues Parson of the American Folklore Society gives the other $700. But Carter G. Woodson made Zora go interview. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to do it at first. But we see this transition. She returns in 1928, and she's bringing him clingstone peaches and watermelon, and she's learning how to sit in space and time and let him move through his own emotions. And I think that comes through not just in the original. The original, I mean, you will be blown away. But then in how you present it to children, the thoughtfulness, it's almost, when I read it, it was like, oh, Dr. Kendi's sitting right here reading this to me and giving me the education to say, hey, this is what slavery actually was in a way that you can understand it. And now let me bring in Zora so you can envision her sitting on the porch, eating watermelon and pecans and peaches with this man who experienced this atrocity, this violence against his person. But he's telling it. I'm telling you. I thought Magnolia Flower, I was like, that's the peak. And then you came with Barracoon, Dr. Kendi.
Well, and I can tell you it's extremely hard, to adapt Barracoon precisely for what you just described. There was the layer of, Cujo telling his story, and then there was the Zora Neale Hurston, and I wanted to hold true to both their voices. There were two voices, and then there was the exchange of those two voices, and so of course it was incredibly difficult to try to hold their voices and the authenticity of their voices while also making it appropriate, for children. But I mean, what are we doing this work if it isn't, challenging? And part of the reason why that was critical for me is because, as we know, celebrating Zora cared so deeply about voice, right? The very reason why she wasn't able to get this book published, because people wanted her to change Cujo's voice.
Yes.
And she refused, just as she refused to change her voice and the voices of her characters in her novel. She wanted them to speak as they truly sounded. And of course, I wanted young people to also hear uh, the voices that Zora so treasured and captured.
Yes. And I think so. Dr. Kendi preserved that while putting his own spin on voice. But I can tell you, Zora's Garden is written in dialect. It's a 52-page book. And that doing 52 pages of it is hard. So doing a full length manuscript, I can't imagine, and maintaining the conventions that have been invented for Zora, and then you taking it and saying, hey, I'm going to preserve this. I think it's incredible. But I thank you for doing that challenging work. And I have to ask you, because now we have to rate them. We're 3 books in. So we have Barracoon, Magnolia Flower, and The Making of Butterflies, all adapted by Dr. Kendi. Where does Barracoon fall in the difficulty and the challenge?
So yeah, I think it was definitely the most challenging.
All right.
And it was the most challenging because, and let me just say, the Making of Butterflies was challenging too, largely because for similar reasons, I wanted to maintain the language, and the voice, and and the irony is that people have, it I think led to some conversation, and one of the things that have tried to explain to people is that young people learn phonetically, right? And so Zora wrote uh, their words in, phonetically, and so this isn't sort of in any way taking away from the learning experience, of young people. If anything, they will internalize it and hear it, and understand it even more deeply. And shouldn't we want them to really understand and internalize what someone who was enslaved was feeling? And then the final reason why it was a challenge is because we're talking about, there just weren't that many people in history who told their story about being born and raised in West Africa, about being, kidnapped from their family, from their hometown, being sort of uh, brought across the Atlantic, in chains, and then being enslaved in Alabama, and then being emancipated, right? And then, thinking that freedom was on the horizon and building Africa Town, uh, but then ultimately suffering the horror, of Jim Crow,
Yeah.
while resisting the whole time and while finding joy in family and love, the whole time. There's very few characters, there's very few individuals whose life stories we have, but we have Cujo's life story because of the great Zora Neale Hurston.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I have no business doing anything that I do. So becoming a children's author, starting children's literacy programming, I happened into all of these things. And I want to touch, it's very important to me that we touch on just what you said, the importance of recording authentic original voice, right? Because for me, when we talk about DEI, a lot of times it's very surface level. Language needs to be a part of DEI because if we're not inclusive, right? When we talk about language and what is the function of language, our children get lost. We think about the visual aspect of children's literature and feeling represented, but when you hear someone say something that sounds like you, plain as day, it hits differently. You absorb it differently. It makes you feel like you belong differently. And so I started with this theory, and so Zora must have been waiting in the wings for me all along to realize that number one, that's the way I talk. It's not just ancestral. When I'm around my people, we're chilling, that's the way that I talk, right? That's the way that my parents talk. That's the way that when we're in community, that's how we talk. And we should be able to. And there's no difference, I'm going to say it, between a Shakespeare and a Zora Neale Hurston saying, I'm going to record in literature the way that this people talks, our people talk. And it's Carla Kaplan and I talk about this to no end. There is no difference, only societal view of what's valid. So when we say things like good English, proper English, then the way that I naturally talk, what are you indicating about the way that I naturally talk? And what does it say about intelligence and how narrow the scope of how we view intelligence is? And so Zora, not just cudgel, but even Their Eyes Are Watching God, it's one of the Library of Congress's books that shaped America. It's like music. And she always asserted, hey, English, the standard English language is too rigid, and Black people then came in and did some good stuff with it. We've added emotion because I have to make sure everyone knows Barracoon, as Dr. Kendi said, it starts with Oluwale Kasula talking about life at home on the continent of Africa, being in West Africa, and not just, hey, I've been enslaved and I'm a slave, right? So now we properly say enslaved because that is a state of being, right? It's a state of being. And so we see him go through that, and then, as Dr. Kendi said, go through emancipation and become one of the leaders in his community to start. But he has a wife, he has children, he suffers the human experience, which, if you don't know, Dr. Kendi, thank you for that. Thank your family, thank your wife, thank your children, because you guys are not excluded from the human experience because of where you are and social importance, right? From society's view. It was the same for, you get all of his experience, someone having to live with him, to take care of him because he's ill, suffering the death of children, feeling all alone all over again, longing to go home. And we need that because it's when we look at historical stories, and I won't even call them stories, historical facts, it's very easy to remove the personal connection. The fact that slavery happened to people. And for children, my he just turned 7 on Friday. He has those questions. Okay, mama, I have to do this family tree. Who's all in your family? Where do they come from? Hey, I only know back to here because of this. And here's why. Now I can fill in some holes. And when we talk about, first off, I recommend adults read both books and then start to have conversations and read Adapted for Young Readers with your children, because they are curious. They are hearing things. And to have this lovingly done personal narrative that they can connect with before they go to school and hear things, before they watch TV and see things, and have the experience with you. Dr. I mean, I can't, I can't, it's remarkable. And to have it in this day and age, we think about our experiences. I asked my grandmother, I saw a picture of her growing up in Mitchell County, Georgia, and she was about 7 or 8, and she had on her Sunday best. She in the country, y'all. I was told my family was sharecroppers. They were sharecroppers. But I had a certain image from school of what that meant to be a sharecropper, what it meant to be a Black person in the Jim Crow South. And here she is in her Sunday best with bobby socks with all the frills, hair pressed with bows, and she's feeding the chickens, a bunch of chickens. We, not just our children, we need to hear Cudjo's story so that we can start to open and expand our minds to what we know about our people, about our history. Because it doesn't stop when they were slaves, and it didn't start when they were enslaved. And that's what Cudjo's story is. My favorite Zora book, as you can probably tell.
I mean, and it's something you said, that slavery happened to people, right? It I think with so many different horrific aspects of our history, and particularly something that happened to tens of millions of people, it's easy for us to forget that they were individuals, right? Uh, they were real people. They were everyday people, who were experiencing this, and I think what distinguishes even this story, Lewis's story, from even many of the quote slave narratives, is because the story starts in Africa. The history of Black people does not start in enslavement, right? And and I think that there's something about a child starting a life story in which the person becomes enslaved in their own community, with their family, with their friends, with their mentors, with their father and mother, learning and playing. There's something that humanizes, that allows that child to connect to that child, right? Um, and to even more deeply understand really the atrocity that was enslavement, to ensure that when they come of age, they will be a part of those who ensure that that it never happens again. And it's interesting, even in terms as we talk about language. You know, people imagine that way African Americans speak is quote broken English and or improper English. But what I don't think people realize is that English is is stems from German and Latin, but nobody calls English broken German, right? Or broken, right? And but we easily could. And language is essentially a form of communication with rules. And African Americans, like other peoples of African descent, in Cuba and Brazil, in Antigua, in Suriname, created their own way of speaking, their own way of communicating, which not only which allowed their own African languages to essentially fuse with the European languages of their enslavers, and which also demonstrated their humanity. That despite being enslaved, they were creating. They were creating languages, and I'm just excited that Zora was able to capture his voice, and our young people will be able to hear his voice today.
Yes. And I want to say that it deserves a ton of respect because they didn't come here. Our ancestors didn't come here and go to school. They came here under very violent circumstances, under very traumatizing circumstances. And for hundreds of years, generations of our ancestors were subjected to a range of living that we cannot even conceptualize or contextualize. And so it wasn't, hey, we come here, they're integrating us into society, and we're exposed to the rules of language. A lot of times we're hearing things and then we're trying to glean understanding, and then we have to speak, right? And so to be able to do that and to be able to navigate a world in which you have been given no level of thoughtful exposure or understanding to that culture, and to still be able to survive and move forward and to birth future generations is quite miraculous. It's quite miraculous. And like Zora said, she said, there is no poet greater in this world than the Southern preacher, right? A lot of these preachers weren't necessarily literate. And so what they could read and what they could glean, they had Zora's father was an itinerant pastor, itinerant preacher in the American South. He had been born in enslavement, right? And here I am, and I always say this, if bootylicious can make it into the Webster's dictionary, language is a lot more fluid than we would like to believe. And we have to start accepting that. But when we talk about the roots of ancestral storytelling and being able to move through cultures and communicate, Zora was it. So even though we're talking about Barracoon, the exciting release of Barracoon adapted for young readers, which happens on the 23rd of this month, I encourage everyone to actually learn about Zora and how much of a trailblazer she was, not just in literature, but the field of anthropology. Because when Zora started this, at that time called the American Indian, that is what the field of anthropology was focused on. And Zora herself said, hey, wait a minute. All the stuff you're collecting from them, those cultural artifacts, Black people got that too. And I can prove it. And she sat out on a life to prove it. But she was the first. And so, Dr. Kendi, I look at this adaptation, and you are the first. When you talk about, I'm going to be brave enough and sum up all the courage I got to not only adapt Zora's work, but to make it available for children. This is what the continuum looks like. So you have Zora. Well, I'm going to take it one step further. You have Oluwale Kasula, Cudjo Lewis, and then you have Zora, and then you have Dr. Kendi, and then you have this wide open field that's happening for our children. Because I think that's the power of great literature. You can write it and you can have your vision of who's going to read it and what they're going to get from it all you want, but you never know. And this allows our children to produce something, to become something, to learn something, adapt something, take it, and to keep this continuum of legacy going. So I thank you, Dr. Kendi. I do. I truly do.
I thank you, and I thank you for lifting and holding and and treasuring, and I don't think, let me just say, I've also been blown away about, she, as you mentioned, was not only this sort of pioneering and trailblazing anthropologist, but she was critiqued by her peers for doing this work. She was critiqued not only by racist white editors, but even other Black writers who were like, why are you collecting and writing those stories about everyday Southern rural Black folk?
Yes.
You're quote making us look bad, or they don't matter, like Northern Black folks or elite Black folks, or you should be focused on presenting Black uh, people in this quote positive light to convince white people that we're equal. And and Zora was like, if a white person thinks that there's something wrong with us, they're the problem, not us. We don't, conform ourselves, change ourselves, create stories to, and that's one of the reasons, why she was adamant about creating stories as Black people were, or as Black people envision themselves, to be. And she faced all sorts of criticism
Yes.
for doing that, not only from again from racist white publishers, but even other authors, even people like Richard Wright, and a host of other, particularly Black male writers. And I let me just say, that is one of the reasons why I'm also inspired to do this, because I know how many, particularly Black male writers, were so deeply critical, of Zora. And I think it's important for us Black male writers to ensure that we're making up for the way we treated Zora during her lifetime.
Oh, Dr. Kendi, you saying you getting your literary forefathers together for Zora. I love that. And if it's okay, if we can have a few more minutes, I actually think it's a good time to actually provide that history lesson, if that's
Of course.
okay. Because, all right, so Scholar Hat, I'll put that on. One of the things when I'm giving Zora talks and I'm teaching about Zora, one of the things that I think we have gotten mixed up in the way that we present the Harlem Renaissance is, number one, we don't situate it properly in history, right? So the Harlem Renaissance started in 1925 with Charles S. Johnson of the Urban League saying, hey, I'm going to compete essentially with the NAACP and start a literary journal. And so he called it Opportunity. And so in 1925, he is situated in New York and he has essentially these funnels around the nation. And he decides he needs young Black talent to publish work in this literary magazine. And so at that time, Zora had been at Howard. And Elaine Locke, who was a psychology professor at Howard, he oversaw a literary club called The Stylist. It was very competitive. Zora was in that too. Well, Elaine Locke is essentially, I believe she called him the midwife or the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, and he's funneling his students' work to Charles S. Johnson. And so Charles S. Johnson says, okay, we're going to take it up a notch. So we're actually going to do a whole award ceremony. And this is 1925 in Harlem. And he gathers not just the Black artists, he's gathering white people who consider themselves progressive. All of them weren't as progressive as they thought they were. He's gathering white artists, politicians, essentially positioning them to be patrons of these young Black artists. And so Zora submits to the first Opportunity Awards, and she's the one who wins the most. Now, she's also the only Southern person to be in the Harlem Renaissance, to be at this table, which is significant in and of itself. Because at this time, this is a political movement. We usually think about, oh, this is the greatest Black artistic movement in the history. Yes, but it was the artistic organ of a political movement in which Black people were saying, how do we want to identify as a group? Enslavement is over. Now we have to put forth who we are. And Black thought leaders at the time, it was to assimilate into white culture. This is, we don't eat watermelon and fried chicken no more. We don't know nothing about the folk. This is where the talented 10th comes from. So, hey, we're going to get the cream off the top for the most talented Black people. 10th percentage, and the 90th will come
Yep.
along later, right? And so this is the thought. If you look at the attire, then we dressed up, we buttoned up, we speak proper English. We don't eat watermelon, we don't eat chicken, we don't eat with our hands, right? And here comes Southern Zora Neale Hurston, and she's like, I can do that, but I'm not going to do that. And she's writing in dialect. She is capturing Black idiom. And when people like it, they like it. But when they don't, they don't. And so when we're talking about her peers that criticize her, it's not just the authors. We're talking about Zora fighting folks in the academy, in academia, and she's fighting Black thought leaders, which she thought was foolish to even have Black thought leaders. She was like, how's one person going to speak for all of us? Right? And so Zora could own and run a room because they had after parties, Dr. Kendi, which I love. So after the award ceremony on May 1st, 1925, where Zora has won all the awards, everyone is now on notice that Zora Neale Hurston is a writer and she has something special that nobody else has, right? She decides to move to New York with $1.50 in her pocket. She said she didn't have anything. And I want to make that clear. Zora didn't come from some privileged background where she had all of this money and she could just go wherever she wanted to. She chose to. She said her suitcase was so empty, she put newspaper in it to keep the few contents from rattling around. She moves to New York to jump at the sun and to take this chance. But at the after party, y'all, this is true Zora fashion. She walks in, stops the party, throws a brightly colored scarf over her shoulder, and yells out the title of one of her award-winning short stories, Color Struck.
Yeah.
Color Struck, which is a whole nother conversation, but Color Struck. But this is who this woman was. She said, I think it's silly. Watermelon is delicious, and it has ancestral roots because it's the only food that can give you all the water and vitamins you need to survive. That's why we eat watermelon. I'ma still eat watermelon, and I like watermelon. And this is how I talk. This is how my people talk. I'm still gonna talk like this. And she could rival anyone who wanted to go toe to toe with vocabulary, philosophy, all of. But she chose that she did not identify her intelligence, her value, or her worth by that. So I think this is a good place. I like to give homework, so y'all got some homework to do. If you want to know about Zora herself, I recommend Valerie Boyd's Wrapped in Rainbows, the biography beautifully done, and may Valerie Boyd rest in peace. And then I recommend that you read Carla Kaplan's Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters, 600 letters edited by Carla with 3,000 annotations. Those are my two greatest sources. If you want to see the beauty of Zora's work, because you do, I recommend that you read Barracoon, and then you read Barracoon Adapted for Young Readers. And you can read those in any order, the Barracoons, because you're going to get something special from each. And Dr. Kendi, my friends at HarperCollins, we got something really good. If you're really ready, if you're really about the Zora life and you want to celebrate Zora, there's this 10-book box set. This thing is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And you can read Zora's work, her autobiography. You can even read how her and Langston Hughes fell out in this box set. And there's actually a sweepstakes going on right now on HarperCollins, and it goes through the 11th. So make sure you look at those rules. Get these books. And Dr. Kendi, congratulations. January 23rd, Barracoon Adapted for Young Readers comes out.
I'm so excited. You know, I really am really excited about this book, and I can't wait to get my first final copy, because I can't wait to give it to my daughter. In many ways, I think that this book, Barracoon, can be an introductory book on enslavement for children, you know, everywhere. And and I think that, and that just really excites me because I think it's so important that our children understand our history. I think it's so important that our children are respected uh, by us, seeking to teach them and explain to them, about our history. And I especially think this is incredibly important in this moment when they are trying to literally ban our history books, particularly, on slavery. So, as they ban books, I just come out with new ones.
Yes. And I have, guys, forgive me. I'm so excited to talk to Dr. Kendi. I didn't read the comments that were happening too much, but someone said they're so impressed by how humble you are. And I have to tell this funny story if it's okay. The first time Dr. Kendi is responsible essentially for me working for the trust in many ways because we had our first interview and I interviewed Dr. Kendi and I mispronounced his first name the whole time. I called him Ibram, and it's Ibram. And he not once, it was not this era of pretension or, hey, it's all about me. We talked again, and he's like, oh, no, it's fine. And he's a MacArthur Genius Fellow, y'all. He has all the credentials to be pretentious and to be rude and inaccessible, and he is not. So the humble, this is truly who this man is, and it is impressive how much you give. And so I am so excited for you to also be able to give the first copy to Imani so that you have that moment for yourself. And I have to tell you guys, it actually was by happenstance that I met you after we did the Magnolia interview. It was Zora. I would say it's Zora Magic, because I was introduced to Janine Cook, and she said, "Oh, I would like to have you be my guest for this event." I had no idea what the event was, and it was you. It was you. And so Dr. Kendi, I mean, he is one of our world's treasures. And so make sure you guys support him because he's always under attack for speaking up, for being a leader. He is not in some comfy, cozy position. So keep that encouragement coming for him and make sure that you guys get Barracoon. If you get a chance to see Dr. Kendi live, you need to. On his page, he has the Barracoon tour up, so you can go see where he's going to be. You can go clap very loudly for him and express your appreciation by being present. Because when we talk about publishers producing books such as these, it's you guys who make the difference. It's you guys who drive the push for the books to happen. So we need you now to show up. And Dr. Kendi, I have one more gift for you. You
Yes.
ready? All right. So our magnolia flower, because it's Zora's birthday, and magnolias were actually Zora's favorite flower. And so today we're giving Zora her flowers and sharing them with Dr. Kendi. The Trust had those interviews re-edited, and we decided to re-release your magnolia flower interview today. And so now it's up live on YouTube. I will email you the link so you have it. But I think you're going to love the re-edit, and I'm just so thankful to be in continued conversation with you.
Thank you as always, Ray. I truly do appreciate you and your light, and your voice, and I know, or I suspect, and I truly believe that you're really making Zora proud.
Oh, thank you. I feel the same. I feel the same about you. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
All right, take it
All
easy.
righty. Congratulations again, Dr.
Thank
Kendi.
you.
You're welcome.
Take it easy.